where they're going to be better off next year than today. Of course they don't. Why should they? They're going to be taxed more next year. They're going to have their societies falling apart a bit more next year. They're going to have less and less social cohesion next year.
I just wonder whether we can sort of slightly move away from an advert for conservative tax policy and maybe make a differentiation between the America as metaphor and even as adjective and a pragmatic global understanding of America. So we speak of immigrants who have gone there. Obviously, Christopher Hitchens is an individual who has
by no means typical.
Who has he has reinvigorated.
Want to be called that.
He has reinvigorated this debate, but one has to understand that for Christopher...
Hang on, what debate?
For the situation of the relation between Europe and America. And for example, one has to understand that for Christopher, his understanding and engagement with the idea of America is couched in an Enlightenment, almost romantic sense. America is adjective, the possibilities of a new global state. And of, which tie into a sort of liberal interventionist ideal. Now, I think it's problematic to say, as I understand that you were discussing with Alan earlier, that this is characteristically a problem under George W. Bush. If we look at the reception of America, for example, in Latin America during the 80s and early 90s, America is still being seen as a pariah state, as a nation that is not faithful to its constitution, to its values, which your friends carry around in their pockets. And I wonder whether it's important to, rather than suggesting that continents are monolithic and that Europe now represents a sort of degraded moral
I'll tell you,
state.
Far, far from it. Continents are not monolithic anymore, and Europe is describing how not monolithic they are, because Europe 20 years from now is going to look very, very different from Europe today and very different from Europe of 50 years ago. This is part of the problem. Part of the problem is that Americans used to know what they could rely on in Europe. They used to typify certain countries. You used to say, France will have these characteristics and that characteristics.
Well,
you can't
say that.
Yeah, well, they do. But you can't say, you won't be able to say what France is going to behave like in 20 years' time. You won't be able to say that it'll be the same suspicious way that in which it behaves at present. The continent of Europe is changing in such major ways because of demographics, because people aren't having enough children, because of the incredible, overwhelming immigration which has happened way beyond any scale which any of the societies in Europe can cope with that have had to put up with it. And so the truth is that what America used to believe was its ally continent, or countries which it understood, has now slipped away. And I don't think anyone's going to be able to get that back again.
Mark, is it that serious? Douglas painted a very...
No,
having started, by saying...
sort of startled into such... No, I think it's terribly important, and I do worry about this. It's particularly a problem with American conservatives, that they do start to think Europe's lost. And it's desperately important that they don't think that we keep pointing out to them that Europe and America actually need each other in the problems.
But is Europe lost? I mean, Douglas has made the point that in 20 years, in his view, Europe will be lost, or changed at the very... I mean, changed or lost. Would you use the term lost?
We might not have thought in the past that
would you use it lost, though? Yes.
No, it's not yet lost, but it could be. But we used to talk in the past about what the Élysée would behave like, what the French foreign ministry would do and things. I don't think we'd have ever guessed, say 50 years ago, that we would come to a point where the French president effectively doesn't have that much control over his, or indeed any control over his foreign policy in, say, the Middle East, because he has such a huge 10% of his population which is radicalized and willing to turn out onto the streets if he supports a war or argues for something which they don't agree with. It's undoubtedly it's going to change your society, it's going to change your cabinet, it's going to change the way you run politics. And really you can't pretend it won't, because I mean you see someone like Jack Straw has a very large Muslim community in his constituency which is going to be growing. That's going to change the way people like him vote. If you're going to stand in Jack Straw's constituency at the next election, you better make sure that you're not a raving pro-Zionist neocon.
But to take the case of Jack Straw, of course, he stood up and made the case about face veils because he was so worried about it, because he was encountering it in his constituency. I think what will happen is that, I mean, I agree, it's important that people talk about this and they realise that in France, those cities where there are those issues in the banlieue, in Holland, where there's going to be the issue of Muslim majorities in some of their cities really very soon, these are important things that we talk about. But to suggest that it's all going to fall away...
Well, if it's not going to fall away, what are we going to do?
What I'm saying is, I think that there's a...
What
we talk about it in terms of
do?
demographics, and it suggests that it's about majorities. It's not. It's a problem of a kind of fascism. And as it's a kind of fascism, it's about a minority who use brutality and violence to control the majority. So it's about putting down a small number of people who are very dangerous. And I think it's important to characterise it that way, instead of a flood of people overwhelming us.
The point is that your small minority plays to a larger and larger home pool.
I don't deny it's a problem, but I just think that it's important that we're going to have to deal with it.
But what are you going to do to deal with it?
We
can't tell America that Europe's nearly lost, or that it's quite a bit away from being lost, or that we're in a really bad state unless we have some kind of answer. We can't play that game. Either we know what we're going to do to stop it, or we should tell them that we're moving over quite soon.
But Britain has been doing well, I think.
Give me the green card.
Yes.
Okay, I mean,
you've been watching this.
I mean, I guess firstly, there's a practical point. I mean, what does it actually mean to say that the continent that created and that cultivated liberalism as a political and an international philosophy, and that did so much to disseminate liberal ideas around the world, is lost? I mean, what exactly does that mean? It is at the moment a nexus for, and I know Douglas has spent some time in Holland, for the challenges facing the ideal liberal society. For, who will stand for plurality is the question that we face in Europe. And will the liberals who believe in a heterogeneous society, but one bound together by a commitment that every individual holds to be a good citizen under, if you don't like the EU constitution, a certain set of values? Or will it be one whereby the unholy alliance of socialists and hard conservatives, whether they be in the Islamic community or whether they be those who in the West defended hardline Islamic reactions to the cartoons as we witness, will they come together in an unholy alliance to challenge liberals? So the sense of saying Europe is lost doesn't seem to me to be particularly productive.
The question of our values is an important one, which we come back to. I mean, my point about the American Constitution is, if you can't put your values pretty much on one piece of paper, if you need thousands of pages, I'm suspicious that you might not have any values, and this might be padding. I mean, you know, it seems to me, and it's very much the case in Britain at the moment, that our values are such, the things that we know we believe in, or believed in, the institutions of state, the rule of law, the monarchy, the church, all of these great things that made Britain, have one by one been attacked. The education system, further education, our collegiate systems, have one by one been attacked. And more than that, more importantly than that, people who say they support them feel slightly embarrassed as they do so. I mean, Orwell pointed this out 60 years ago, so part of it isn't new. But the notion that you can't stand up for any of your values, and that if I asked the average person on the continent of Europe, what do you believe in, the likelihood would be either that one would be, one is, brought back with a sense of either cynicism, that there are no particular values, or dumbfounded incomprehension. People are embarrassed by it. That's not something you find in America, and I'm not surprised that Americans are suspicious of Europeans when they can't even say what they stand for.
Okay, but many of Americans' values, of course, originate on the European continent. The American Constitution,
being secured there.
Right, absolutely. Ignoring the attempt to sort of use Orwell to defend, you know, a sort of conservative church and an educational system, but both of which he passionately opposes. I wonder whether it's possible, and we're going to touch on this a little later, to speak about the importance of American, European and Middle Eastern liberals and Democrats uniting to form a global commitment to stand for securing liberties and human rights across the world, and for us to not posit, as you have suggested, that some irresponsible journalists do, that certain continents represent monolithically certain attitudes towards the world, but that we are all open, that we all fight the horror of authoritarianism and reactionary politics, and that we must all unite to challenge those things.
Yeah, but we come back to the point of what are you going to do to challenge them? And it's all very well for Europeans to talk about standing for their values, but in recent years in particular, they've proved very bad at standing for those values. Every time, for instance, freedom of speech issues have come up in this continent, if I include Britain and Europe for a moment, we failed badly. every time, I mean, you know, you would not find a case analogous to that which has happened in most European countries now, where writers have been prosecuted. I'm thinking of Oriana